Thanks very much. I'm going to do my imitation of Jeremiah tonight. I'm going to curse the darkness instead of lighting candles. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I think what we've had going on is more than a particular policy problem that we need to deal with. I think it is a much more profound problem with American society as a whole. And let me be as blunt as I can be about describing what it is. What Katrina did was pull back the screens for a few minutes on a problem that has been getting worse over the last, well, since the 1960s. But what makes this interesting is that nobody had been noticing. Those of you of a certain age can remember the 1980s and Ronald Reagan's administration when the underclass was a really big deal. And people talked about it a lot. And the shredding of the safety net was a major Democratic argument. And the urgency of dealing with the underclass was seen on many sides as very, very high. Then it disappeared from view. It is not completely a partisan issue. It didn't disappear from view after Bill Clinton got elected. You'll notice during the 1992 election, nobody was talking about the underclass anymore. And it had stopped being an issue in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Nobody talked about it at all during the Clinton administration. Nobody talked about it at all during the 2000 election. What had happened was not that the underclass had gone away. On the contrary, if you take the ways in which you measure an underclass, it had been steadily increasing. Let me give you three indicators that I use as sort of aggregate guidelines for tracking the size of the underclass. One of these is criminality. That's obvious. When I talk about the underclass, just to give you a very brief definition of terms, I'm not talking about poor people. I'm not talking about the person who is out of work but really wants a job, and all you need to do is point that person toward a job and they're going to grab it. I'm talking about people who are either preying directly on other members of the community or are preying indirectly insofar as they're unable to be productive members of the community. I'm talking about incompetence in some cases. I'm talking about lack of socialization in other cases. I'm talking about outright violence in still others. But the common denominator of all of this is that they are in some sense shut out from participation in the mainstream of American society. Three indicators. First, criminality. Crime's gone down. Yes, but we have 1.5 million more people in prison than we had in the mid-1980s. There may be a causal relationship there somewhere. Criminality, in terms of the proportion of young males who exhibit criminality, has gone up as a proportion of young males. Notice I did not say black males. I said males, because it's been happening among whites as well. Young men not in the labor force, even though they aren't in school. Sounds pretty innocuous, doesn't it, until you think about, now, why is it that somebody who's 18 years old and male and is not in school would not even be in the labor force, not even looking for work? And as you think about what can create that kind of situation, it's not that they're living off trust funds. They are engaged, once again, in failing to become members of society in the most basic kind of ways that young males are supposed to. Well, in the boom year of 1999, I'll pick that because that was the very height of the boom, when you couldn't walk down the street without tripping over a help wanted sign. 22% of all black males aged 16 to 24, not in school, were not even looking for work. That doesn't count the ones in prison, doesn't count the ones who are unemployed. At the same time, at that point, about 8% of all white males were in that fix as well. By 2005, those numbers were up to 1/4 of all young black males and 10% of all young white males. Once again, the trend line is going up faster for whites than for blacks. And finally, there is the proportion of children born out of wedlock. I focus on that rather than the more positive news that you sometimes hear about things like the teenage fertility rate, because that's the nature of the problem. The problem is not the size of the next generation being raised by single women. It is what happens when you have a high density of children without fathers. That's the problem, which social science has documented to a fairly well, creates enormous difficulties, and in my view is the driver of the underclass. Well, among blacks, we've had about 70% of all kids born out of wedlock now for about 10 years. a number that is so staggering it's hard to comprehend. Among whites, it's now up to a quarter of all whites, 25%. That's higher than the proportion that caused Daniel Moynihan to talk about the breakdown of the black family in the early 1980s. And if you're saying to yourself, well, whites, that includes Hispanics, and they have higher rates. No, I'm talking about non-Hispanic whites, 25% out of wedlock. These statistics are mirrored in the phenomena that we saw in New Orleans after Katrina, but you'll find the same thing if you go to Iowa and talk to social workers about the kids growing up with parents on meth, with males who are dysfunctional and violent. You'll find the same thing in white communities and black communities around the nation, with a growing population of people who are fundamentally not included in America. 2 quick comments, and I'll stop, because I think I probably get my 10 minutes already. The first is, why is it that we haven't been paying any attention to this group for all these years, except for the 15 minutes after Katrina? And the answer, my friends, is we're doing fine, thank you. And by we, I mean the kind of people in this room. Which is to say, we lowered crime, which was scaring us in the 1980s. We got rid of the homeless everywhere except San Francisco and Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they're sort of necessary for the aesthetic of the city. We got rid of graffiti, which was very menacing and dangerous to us, and we don't have to worry about kids from the poor section of town being bussed over to our schools anymore. We got the underclass out of our face, and it's just as cynical as that. That's why it's not an issue. The other question is, well, what's the big problem, actually? Because the underclass isn't begging to be rescued. We can afford them, which we can. America will go on and be as great an economic power and a geopolitical power as ever, even though we have this underclass at this size, and even though it's been growing. So what's the big deal? The problem is not that it will affect America as an economic power, nor that it will affect America as a geopolitical power, but that it fundamentally betrays America as an idea. Thank you.